thank all of you, and again, welcome. I typically do the first talk to sort of set the topic up for the conference. This year, our theme is the Inklings, and I am delighted to begin with this topic. One of the great privileges of my whole life was the opportunity to go and study at Oxford. And one of the very first things I did was go to Pusey House and join the Oxford Society, in which I eventually met the son of C.S. Lewis and Joy. I heard him speak at the C.S. Lewis Society, and learned firsthand about this amazing group that so influenced the world. This PowerPoint can be made available to you. We'll talk about if you'd like for us to email it so that you can download it. So just see Father Casey or Kathy about that. The Inklings, the Oxford Inklings. It all begins in that mysterious medieval world of Oxford, circa 1920s and 30s. This is not part of the PowerPoint. So if you attempt to download this, don't do it. Let me try this. Okay. We'll wait for the technology to catch up.
Right, at this time.
Okay, it all begins with this amazing world in the 1920s and 30s, Oxford, England. And Oxford is kind of a magical place. When you go there, you feel like you're stepping back into the Middle Ages, because in some sense, you always are. But late one evening, in a conversation lasting to 3 a.m. in the morning of September 19, 1931, what's called Addison's Walk behind Magdalen College, Oxford. This college in Cambridge is called Magdalen College. And there's a really important philosophical, theological reason why Magdalen College is called Magdalen College in Cambridge. And you know what it is? Because Cambridge and Oxford hate each other. So it has to be called Magdalen College. Three Oxford dons, Oxford don is a professor or a teacher, were strolling Addison's Walk together on this evening. They were C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Henry Victor Dyson, of whom we'll talk about a little bit more later, who was a fascinating inkling of the group. But that night, these three were walking along Addison's Walk. Lewis was struggling with the relationship between imagination and reason. He had become a theist by this point, but he was struggling with the relationship between imagination and reason. In particular, he wrestled with Christian symbols, as he said, like the resurrection, which already tells you something about how he was struggling. Is the resurrection a symbol, or is it reality? That was his issue. The issue was the historicity of the story, the legend, the tale. Can symbol be historical or true? Does story with symbol need to be deconstructed to find historicity and veracity? Which you know is what the deconstructionists are committed to. They see a disjunction between symbol and reality. Well, not necessarily do these have to be separated. Hans Frey in his Eclipse of Biblical Narrative, Beverard Childs, and the Yale hermeneutical movement particularly Fry, in his Eclipse of Biblical Narrative, talks about what the Enlightenment did in separating history from symbol, and argues that the Christian faith does not separate history from symbol, reality from symbol. You start separating history from symbol, and we get a separation of reality and symbol. And he says that is not the historic Christian position. And he argues for what he calls a pre-Enlightenment world and life view, which didn't separate reality from symbol. Lewis had joined Tolkien's The Coal Biters Society in the 1920s, which Tolkien was a major leader. Coal biter referred to the group having to sit so close to the fire they almost had to bite the coals. That was their name. The group was dedicated to reading Icelandic and Norse sagas, Beowulf and beer sessions, eventually morphing into the Inklings. It progressed beyond Beowulf, but it still involved beer. But on that night, Lewis told Tolkien in 1931 on Addison's Walk at about 1 a.m. in the morning, he said to Tolkien, "Myths are lies." And Tolkien responded, "Myths are not lies." Lewis explained in some detail in a letter to Arthur Greaves, quote, October 1931, "Now what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this. Tolkien explained the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with tremendous difference that it really happened." That was the statement that Tolkien presented to Lewis. Tolkien showed Lewis how the two sides could be reconciled in the gospel narratives. The Gospels had all the qualities of great human storytelling, but they portrayed a true event. God, the storyteller, entered into his own story in the flesh and brought a joyous conclusion from a tragic situation. Suddenly, Lewis could see that the nourishment he had always received from the great myths and fantasy stories was a taste of that greatest, truest story of the life, death, and the resurrection of Christ. And of course, that continues to be a theme in Lewis's writings, that all the great tales of humanity are but a shadow of the greatest and the truest tale, the gospel. From this period on, Lewis believed in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the veracity of the resurrection. And eventually, Lewis would influence Tolkien in other ways. It would sort of come back around. The unpayable debt that I owe to him was not influence, but sheer encouragement. Tolkien wrote decades later, he was for long my only audience. In fact, that eventually becomes a part of a tension that grows between these two great friends, which we'll talk about in a moment. And thus began one of the most important and influential Christian and literary relationships of the 20th century. Tolkien, Tollers, as Lewis called him, would eventually call Lewis every man's theologian. When The Lord of the Rings was published, Lewis said of it, "This book is like lightning from a clear sky. It represents the conquest of new territory." In a letter to a friend, Lewis hoped the book, quote, would inaugurate a new age. In some sense, in the literary, certainly the Christian literary world, it did, and I think it is larger than just what has happened in the Christian world. So who were the Inklings? A rather large group of people, most of whom you've probably never heard about. Properly speaking, wrote Warren Lewis, C.S. Lewis's older brother, the Inklings was neither a club nor a literary society, though it partook of the nature of both. There were no rules, officers, agendas, or formal elections. And yet how could this, as Tolkien would coin a phrase for us, how could this fellowship of the chalice have so much influence? Well, of course, C.S. Lewis, you know him, a professor of medieval literature, author, primarily of children's literature, perhaps the reason why he was not awarded a Regius Chair in Oxford. And in the 1950s was awarded a chair at Magdalen College, which, by the way, was a college in Cambridge where I did all my research. And he finished out his career and his life. J.R.R. Tolkien was professor of Anglo-Saxon literature and history, a philologist. Charles Williams was a literary critic who worked for Oxford University Press, was really the theologian of the group. A profound man who died prematurely in 1945 as a young middle-aged man, left us 7 fantasies and a slew of theological essays that are absolutely amazing. Owen Barfield was a British philosopher and poet. Christopher Tolkien was the third son of J.R.R. Tolkien, professor of English language at Oxford. Warren Lewis was the older brother of C.S. Lewis, a British officer and somewhat amateur writer, as he would sometimes describe himself. Roger Lancelyn Green was a children's writer, wrote many children's stories. Adam Fox was canon and dean of divinity at Magdalen College, Oxford. Hugo Dyson was a committed Christian and academic. Tolkien later said, although our habit was to read aloud compositions of various kinds and lengths, and sometimes they would read to each other all day long at one pub, cross the street and continue reading into the night at another pub. This association and its habit would in fact have come into being at that time, whether the original short-lived club had ever existed or not. In some sense, he's touching on the fact that in the middle of the 20th century, there was a Christian revival of some sort that began in England and spread to America. Well, continuing with the list, Robert Havard was the physician of C.S. Lewis and his wife, and a very loyal and faithful Inkling. J.A.W. Bennett was a literary scholar. Lord David Cecil was professor of rhetoric and English literature. And Neville Coghill was a theatrical producer. Came to probably greatest of fame when he produced the Broadway musical Canterbury Tales, which won a Tony Award in 1968. When we look at this group, it was amazingly diverse in terms of literary and academic skills. And that in itself was a great strength. They would meet on Tuesdays at the Eagle and Child, sometimes nicknamed the Bird and Baby. And they would go all day, many times, until the Eagle and Child closed, and then they would go across the street to the Lamb and Flag and continue into the evening. So in the Eagle and Child, it says the Eagle and Child takes its name from the motifs of the crest of the Earls of Derby. The pub, which has stood here since 1650, is a favorite with Oxford academics and writers. You know, in Oxford, there are the gown pubs and there are the town pubs. And I learned very quickly that as a member of the gown society, never go into a town pub. You might not come out with all your limbs. And favorite with the Oxford academics writers, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, were once regulars. They were part of a literary group called the Inklings, referred to the pub, Bird, and Baby. Here's another plaque hanging. The Eagle and Child, Oxford, the Inklings, until 1963, the great writers of the Inklings, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and others met regularly on this spot. Well, not Williams, because he died in 1945. The conversations that have taken place here have profoundly influenced the development of 20th century English literature. C.S. Lewis, his brother W.H. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and other friends met every Tuesday morning between the years 1939 through 62 in the back room of their favorite pub. These men, popularly known as the Inklings, met here to drink beer and to discuss, among other things, the books they were writing. And I like this one. I think this one's actually in the Lamb and Flag. You know these characters. Pippin, Merry from the Lord of the Rings. Pippin, what's that? Merry, this, my friend, is a pint. You know, a pint of ale. Pippin, it comes in pints. I'm getting one. The four most widely recognized of the Inklings were, of course, Charles Williams, Tolkien, Lewis, Owen Barfield. We can narrow that down further to the three that most of us know something about. Here you see on your far left, Tolkien, in the middle, Lewis, and Charles Williams. But this afternoon, I think we want to focus on Tolkien and Lewis and the world view that they advocated. We could do a somewhat overview of every one of the Inklings, but I think to set the stage for what you're going to learn in the next few days, let's concentrate on Tolkien and Lewis, for they surely did shape the society that we know of as the Inklings. There are many similarities between Tolkien and Lewis, explaining the draw of friendship. And they were great friends. They became best of friends before they drifted apart from each other. Well, they were both what are called outlanders, products of the empire in its day of autumnal glow. Tolkien was from South Africa, where his father was a banker, and Lewis was a Belfast Anglo-Irishman growing up in Northern Ireland. He saw England, they both saw England as home, but they were really outlanders outside of England itself. But earlier years they spent as the colonials, outlanders. Both lost parents, especially mothers, very early. Lewis at 10, and Tolkien was an orphan, literally. The latter was placed under the guardianship of a local Roman Catholic priest who apparently was a great man of God. Both were products of the era of British decline, around the beginning of the last century, where the British Empire basically came to an end from the beginning of the last century through World War II. They, however, fought as officers in the First World War, distinguished themselves heroically, although Tolkien was quite sickly. He became ill, some sort of virus going around. Of course, you know that the great flu epidemic hit the world about this time. Maybe some say perhaps it was the flu. But both witnessed in World War I, because they were there on the front in Europe in some of the most hideous battles of World War I. If you know anything about that war, it was devastating. England lost 1 million men in World War I. And they, as one writer said, they witnessed indescribable carnage which Norman Cantor, the medievalist, says explains the imaginative taste for violence in both of these writers. I mean, they can describe a battle like no other. I mean, think of the Lord of the Rings, all of the battle scenes, great detail. Think of C.S. Lewis, the great battle scene at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and others. The similarities continue. On one occasion in World War I read somewhere, C.S. Lewis was responsible for capturing 80 Germans on one occasion. So these guys, Lewis and Tolkien, they, in one sense, kind of broke the mold of what you see as your typical Oxford Don, right? Kind of an egghead academic. And why is it doing that? I'm not doing anything, Father Casey. He's going to ask me, what did you do? And I didn't do anything. Well, the similarities continue. We'll try to get our screen back here. The scholars both were medievalist in some sense and fond of the old European northern and southern tales. And I'm just going to kind of keep going. You can get the PowerPoints later on as they come up. Both writers mostly wrote fiction, especially fantasy and science fiction. And if you think about the time in which they lived, science fiction was somewhat of a new genre for that period. Jules Verne had been doing it, in the 19th century, but science fiction, think of how it's come on as a genre. It comes on in the 20th century. Both wrote science fiction. Lewis was probably a better science fiction writer than Tolkien, and Tolkien kind of decried that. C.S. Lewis had his adult science fiction. Tolkien wrote an adult science fiction, but it never came off very well. Both were committed Christians. Tolkien a Roman Catholic and Lewis an Anglican. And we're losing our screen here. Both became apologists for Christianity. Tolkien more indirectly and Lewis more directly. And we begin to see kind of somewhat the philosophical difference in strategy. Part of it has to do with personality, which you'll come to in a moment. C.S. Lewis gave those famous talks on the BBC radio during World War II that became a book called Mere Christianity, his Screwtape Letters, Pilgrim's Regress, which is his most philosophical of his apologetical works. They both figured out the tale, particularly science fiction and fantasy, could be used to present a Christian world and life view. They dipped deeply into the well of a Scottish minister and author named George MacDonald, who had lived in the 19th century. And in particular, the old European medieval Catholic Christian world and life view expressed in those tales. Both had the most profound understanding of evil since Augustine and Dante, though they differed on their views of talking about Satan. Think of all that these men wrote about evil. I mean, you could basically say Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, Screwtape Letters are the most amazing commentary on evil in one sense. They knew evil. Lewis knew evil particularly well because, as he said somewhere, He had lived on the other side. He knew what was going on with the occult at a great university like Oxford, which we're now learning more and more about how the occult was spreading across Europe in the early part of the 20th century, even in intellectual and academic communities. I mean, I can remember when I was a college student reading somewhere that Adolf Hitler was involved in the occult, and that Winston Churchill had actually gone to a war room meeting and said, we need to understand that this man is involved in the occult. And they practically laughed Winston Churchill out of the room. Nobody believed him. And it said that Churchill never ever again brought it up. And I remember even when I was in college bringing that up, and it was just kind of sloughed off. But in the last 20 years, we have indeed discovered what was going on inside the Third Reich and the leadership of the Third Reich. They were deeply involved in the occult and had created a dark, dark society of blood oaths and sacrifice and, to quote Ray Bradbury, something that wicked that way comes. So these men had a profound understanding of evil and are invaluable in helping modern humanity that prides itself in thinking that it is not quite as bad as everybody else. You know, that's the problem, one of the problems of Western culture. We don't think we're quite as bad as others while we live on the precipice of extraordinary evil. Well, but like all true good friendships, they can pass through ups and downs, even into troubling times. Even though two can be similar, the differences can accentuate to the point of conflict. I mean, the New Testament spells conflict in the church early on. Remember why the order of deacon was formed by the apostles? It was because two women's groups were at odds with each other. Two groups of widows were at odds with each other. And perhaps portending what we would continue to face all through church history, that those who are close can sometimes end up very much at odds with each other. Maybe that's why the New Testament describes a church that is not perfect and pristine, but a church that must learn how to live through its ups and downs. You know, as one of my professors used to say, if you think you've found the perfect church, don't go to it, you'll ruin it. So even though two can be similar, the differences can accentuate to the point of conflict. Well, Lewis was a very outgoing personality. He was gregarious, easygoing. Tolkien was introverted, shy, liked to be off by himself. Lewis was from the wealthy side of the middle class, not the nobility or the very, very rich, but he was from a somewhat wealthy family background. Tolkien was from a very, very poor background. Tolkien was Roman Catholic. Lewis was Anglican. Tolkien never understood why Lewis did not convert to Rome, why he persisted in remaining Anglican, and really wanted Lewis to become Roman, but Lewis was decidedly Anglican. Tolkien had a long, happy marriage with many wonderful children. Lewis spent most of his life as a bachelor. They differed on their writing approaches, as we'll talk in a moment. They bickered back and forth on how to use symbol and literature, and Tolkien didn't like it that Lewis loved allegory. Tolkien hated allegory, you know, and he would always get burned up when people would write him and tell him what he was really talking about in Lord of the Rings, when in fact he wasn't, you know. In fact, that's the weird thing about the 20th century. Have you ever noticed this? Authors aren't allowed to tell you what their symbolism really means. Somebody else has to tell you. Well, that just kind of goes with kind of the incoherence of the age. So Tolkien liked the tale that presented another world with a basic message. Tolkien didn't like allegory, but used more general symbolism of a world to offer his message. His quasi-hero, Frodo in Lord of the Rings, says to Sam, quote, "I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must be often to be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are my heir, and you will read things out of the Red Book and keep alive the memory of the age that is gone, so that people will remember the great danger, capitals, and so love their beloved land all the more." Well, differences and similarities can sometimes produce rifts between the best of friends. And there was a rift between Lewis and Tolkien. But sometimes, God, the Holy Spirit, uses rifts like Paul and Barnabas. The gospel spread in extraordinary ways because those two men didn't continue to travel with each other. And hence, I think we should expect to see that through church history, sometimes Paul and Barnabas will stop walking with each other for a while, and out of that will come great spread of the gospel. But the rest of the story is that Paul and Barnabas came back together. And we need to come back together. Tolkien wrote in 1964, this is a year after C.S. Lewis's death, "We saw less and less of one another after he came under the dominant influence of Charles Williams." Well, there you have it. Williams was an allegorist. If you've read his 7 fantasies, whopping good. Descent into hell and so forth. But Tolkien really probably didn't like Williams all that much. And then he continues, and still less after his very strange marriage, which was to Joy David Gresham. However, out of that marriage came some of Lewis's greatest insight into suffering. Because he had written a book about suffering before he lived through a marriage to a woman who died right before his eyes of cancer. And to see what he says after her death, after he had lived through the suffering, about suffering, is like night and day. But Tolkien could never understand this marriage, didn't approve it, didn't like it. But God used it. The rift between Lewis and Tolkien, like that conversation between Frodo and Sam at the end of The Lord of the Rings. Frodo chooses to leave Sam behind in the Shire and sail on with Bilbo, Gandalf, and the elves to the Undying Lands. So now that I've told you about the rift, maybe you'll look at this conversation a little differently that's in The Lord of the Rings. It goes like this. "But," said Sam, and tears started in his eyes, "I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire, too, for years and years, after all you have done." Frodo replies, "So I thought to once, but I have been too deeply hurt, Sam." But after Lewis's death, Tolkien wrote to his daughter Priscilla that Jack's, that was what Tolkien called Lewis, Jack's passing, quote, "feels like an axe blow near the roots." They loved each other dearly as close friends, and yet in the latter part of their lives and careers, these two great stalwarts of the Inklings did not see as much of each other and drifted apart. But let's talk about, in the remaining time, about the last half of this introductory lecture, let's talk about the world and life view, what's really going on in the Chronicles of Narnia with C.S. Lewis and The Lord of the Rings with J.R.R. Tolkien. Focusing on Lewis and Tolkien, they told stories that presented a pre-Enlightenment world and life view, because they saw modernity and the approach of postmodernity as containing the seeds of what once was, and therefore so similar to the conflict of neo-pagan and Christian in the Middle Ages. I mean, I've heard some people talk about the Middle Ages, and it became, in many senses, a high water mark of Christianity and culture in the West. But we should not think that the Middle Ages were this idyllic period that lasted from roughly circa AD 500 to the time of the Reformation and beyond. I would really say the Middle Ages continue until the Enlightenment. The Reformation and what followed is really part of the Middle Ages and the medieval world and life view. But that's something we can talk about at another time, maybe. But the Middle Ages was an incredible time of conflict between Christianity and neo-paganism. It's just that Christianity won to a great extent. And Lewis and Tolkien saw that. They saw the Middle Ages as a time, 1,000-year span, give or take a couple hundred years, when a great conflict took place in the West, and Christianity and the church emerged. Norman Cantor is a book called Inventing the Middle Ages. He says the medieval culture is both different from ours and very much in communication with ours, Lewis believed. In this way, there is an ambiguous, tinsel, stretching, and creative relationship between medieval heritage of literature and art and our own way of thinking and seeing. This has never happened before since we put this equipment in. Why, we'd think something else might be going on here. So bear with us as technology brings us low. So I think what I'm going to do is get out of the PowerPoint, and you'll just have to bear with me. As I continue the lecture. Lewis observed of the medieval, the modern, postmodern tendency is to perceive that, quote, in every way, if we have not outgrown, we have at least grown away from the romance of the rose, which was a French romantic masterpiece of the 13th century. Lewis wrote an amazing work that was published a year after his death in 1964. And if you want to read what he was really trying to communicate in his writings, you want to pick up the book, The Discarded Image. He says, Lewis observes that to think we have outgrown the medieval worldview would be superficial. Humanity does not pass through, this is a very important observation, humanity does not pass through phases as a train passes through stations. That's really not how history works. Because history is alive. Being alive, it has the privilege of always moving, yet never leaving something behind. Whatever we have been, in some sort, we are still. Let me repeat that. Lewis writes, whatever we have been, in some sense, we still are. So for Lewis and Tolkien, they believed that as Christians who have passed through the Middle Ages and the medieval church in the West, in some sense, that's who we still are. We've not discarded it. If only we can see that we still are Christians bearing those seeds with us. It says, neither the form nor the sentiment of this old poetry has passed away without leaving indelible traces on our mind. Lewis and Tolkien, however, figured out that if we use the tale, and particularly science fiction and fantasy, we can communicate this worldview. Now, part of it was, even in 20th century England, in the academic world, there was so much hostility to Christianity growing. In pre-World War II, academic communities in Britain, that Tolkien and especially Lewis said, maybe I can communicate this world and life view, this Christian world and life view, if I set it in terms of science fiction. I can get people reading about another world only to discover that I'm talking about this world. Chaucer said the great old stories in his Troilus and Cressida, quote, aim to make dreams truth and fables history. Chaucer wrote Canterbury Tales in the High Middle Ages. Thought the great old stories aim to make dreams truth and fables history. So Lewis writes in 1947, quote, that something which the educated receive from poetry can reach the masses in stories of adventure almost in no other way. So they were taking the great poetry that the educated would spend enough time to try to understand, because poetry makes you labor. You have to, this is a culture, where's the great poetry? Hardly anybody's patient enough to understand poetry, because with poetry you have to meditate. Somebody said, it's emotion put to verse. It draws you in. You have to think about it. You have to read it 50 times to understand it. Well, what would you expect if a human gives you a great wisdom insight? It's kind of like Proverbs. Proverbs is aphoristic poetry. And we could talk about what's going on redemptive historically with this corpus of literature in the Old Testament. But very significantly, that when Messiah, Jesus, comes, how does he preach? He preaches like Solomon. Why don't we preach that way? Lewis and Tolkien got this. That's why they saw the power of the story, the tale, and that was the way to communicate to the masses. They'll always listen to a good story. Hollywood forgets that sometimes. Hollywood, is going through a rather difficult time because they've become so dependent on technology, they've forgotten. It doesn't make any difference what technology you've got. If you don't have a good story, it's lousy. People like a good story. And the greatest stories in the history of the world come from heaven. And Tolkien and Lewis got it. In particular, Lewis, Tolkien, and Williams offered a medieval world and life view. For Lewis, the quest for the Middle Ages was the pursuit of, quote, the compulsive imagination of a larger, brighter, bitterer, more dangerous world than ours. Do you think of the Middle Ages as a more dangerous world than ours? I hope in a few minutes you might have a rethink and see it as it was a much more dangerous world than ours, even though ours is coming closer and closer to all of the elements of medieval Europe. Lewis gave lectures at Oxford and Cambridge on he had this fantastic, I wish I could have heard it. I wish it had been recorded. But the title of his lecture series was The Medieval Imagination. Now, in his book, The Discarded Image, he talks a lot about that. He wrote, quote, "The medieval imagination is not a transforming imagination like Wordsworth's." Wordsworth and the Romantics wrote about the transforming power within nature. And Lewis goes on, or the penetrative imagination of Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare's imagination just cuts right into you if you listen to the lines of his amazing literature. But Lewis says, the medieval imagination is a realizing imagination. And he goes on to say, Dante, who for Lewis was the quintessential example of the medieval imagination, was obsessive about, quote, extremely factual word painting. The details, the comparisons, designed at whatever cost of dignity to make sure that we see exactly what he saw. I mean, that is an incredible skill. For an author to paint a picture of words that brings you to the point of seeing exactly what he's seeing in his mind. That sounds so simple, doesn't it? Try that sometimes. Now, Dante, and this is typically medieval, this realized imagination. The Middle Ages are unrivaled till we reach quite modern times, which is an insightful reference to foreshadowing in medieval culture to the modernist. In sheer foreground fact, the close-up. The great irony of the Inklings, especially of Tolkien, Lewis, and Williams, realist theology, though communicated by way of fantasy, legend, and the story, is the only theology that leads to theology that is a realistic view of God and all of life. I mean, it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? That if you think theology is only symbolic, then you will end up with a distorted view of God and the world. What this means is that all of life appears in pristine color. On the road to Emmaus, when we read in Luke, when they partook of the Eucharist together, those travelers on the Emmaus road, walking with the Messiah himself, and yet he was right there in front of them and they couldn't see him. There's that play in the Gospels, always on blind people who can see better than people who have eyes. And people who have eyes, who can see perfectly physically, are blind as bats spiritually. It's an amazing sub-theme throughout the Gospels. And it bubbles up at the end of Luke's Gospel. And Luke says, when they partook of the Eucharist, their eyes were opened and they saw Jesus. Well, this was the view of the medieval imagination, according to Lewis and Tolkien, and of Dante and all his friends. The medieval scholar Norman Cantor states that for Lewis, this medieval imagination was the product of a tense interaction of three cultural traditions. And so let me summarize these three cultural traditions that, as Norman Cantor says, rest on a tripartite foundation. First is what is called the Romantic. The Romantic tradition that attained its highest development in courtly literature that appears in the Middle Ages. this phenomenal type of literature. The love of poetry, of the aristocracy of France, of southern England, of the Rhine Valley in the latter 12th and 13th centuries. The world in the Middle Ages of courtly love. A powerful theme that comes out of the Middle Ages. I mean, we kind of take it for granted because it's so influenced our culture. It comes right out of Bernard of Clairvaux, who is one scholar, has described the great insightful theologian on the love of God. I mean, the others writing later about the love of God, which of course is a powerful theme in the Holy Scriptures. And it's poignantly captured in the Anglican Way. Perhaps more so than any of the other great traditions. Take the prayer book sometime and see how much the love of God is mentioned. I once had an elderly lady who was a literary scholar in one of my parishes, and I had only gotten to know her after she had long since retired. And she said she'd come from another Protestant background, and she said, the first time in the 1930s when I worshiped in an Anglican church, I found the love of God. Now that's very Celtic. It is a great theme, and it surfaces in the Middle Ages. And Bernard of Clairvaux, who was so influential on many of the 16th century reformers, an often forgotten fact, but just see how much they quote Bernard in their writings. And it's this amazing view of the love of God. And that in the high Middle Ages, the bride of God needs this defender, this knight defender, who will protect her at all cost. And in literature, it becomes a great theme of courtly love. A second major element in the medieval world and life view is that of an ordered universe. This view that the universe has an order and a unity. In fact, we call it a universe. That is a gift from the Middle Ages. And we got what was called a university. Cantor says the second strand of medieval imaginative culture lay in the vast and complex, often university-based, learned conception of a cosmic and world order that came to fruition in the late 13th and 14th centuries, and it is expressed both in academic treatises and in Dante's Divine Comedy, which draws heavily upon systematic learning. The Christian faith moves the mind to find unity in everything, because everything comes from one great triune God. And the third great theme in the Middle Ages that we might tend to miss is that underneath these two cultural traditions of courtly love and the learned structure of cosmic order lies a third force, the pristine, instinctive feeling of a warrior society that became hedged about and largely, but not entirely, submerged by the consciously developed other two cultures. Nowhere is the medieval world and life view more prevalent than Lewis's 7-volume Chronicles of Narnia. But when we read the Chronicles of Narnia and we read Lord of the Rings, they give us the view of a world that's being terrorized by hordes of evil people. And for Tolkien, it's the orcs. Massive hordes coming to terrorize the Western world. And so they write about that. And of course, you may know that in the Middle Ages, that great fear led to a spiritual awakening of being overrun by hordes of evil. And you know, in both their stories, and especially in Lord of the Rings, it's always fascinating how that when it looks darkest, you know, you've got that great scene of Gandalf with the light breaking forth, and Gandalf appearing and coming and rescuing. Well, that's a great medieval theme. That when it gets darkest, God is going to do something. Light is going to appear from heaven. And where you least expect God to come from, He's going to come from there. Like an atheistic academic in one of the great universities of Europe, Oxford, C.S. Lewis, who had dabbled on the other side in the occult, who was an atheist to the core, and yet he becomes one of the greatest Christian apologists in modern times. In fact, my dissertation advisor, Alistair McGrath, would always say to me, he said, you know, watch out for those people who are most vehement against God. They have a way of getting converted. I.e., St. Paul. Who was he? God's full of surprises, and that's another great theme. So there are two basic messages. The first profound medieval message is the reality of evil personified by the devil and represented in the materialism, selfishness, corruption, and self-destructiveness of everyday life. And Lewis and Tolkien differed on their views of whether you should talk about the devil or not talk about him. Tolkien would tell Lewis and believe, you know, don't talk about Satan. I mean, if you talk about Satan, he's going to attack you. Well, Lewis said, but I have to talk about Satan. I have to tell people that he's real and just what he's up to. And he's tricky and he's sneaky. And he's always trying to divide and ruin the people of God. So you'll notice that Tolkien never talks about the devil. Now, evil, I mean, he portrays evil. You know, Sauron and, you know, the great dark wizards of Lord of the Rings, Saruman. But he doesn't per se talk about the devil, and he would tell you that these are not necessarily allegories of Satan, because he didn't like that vehicle of writing. But C.S. Lewis would indeed talk about a personal, real Satan. And he wrote those magnificent letters, Screwtape Letters, that got him on the front cover of Time magazine in 1949. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan says to the devil, or excuse me, says to the evil witch Jadis, he speaks, you remember, of a deeper magic still when, quote, death itself would start working backwards. Now that's based on the preface of the great liturgical tradition at Easter time, where, to paraphrase most of our liturgies, in the Book of Common Prayer, it speaks about death trampling down death. Sounds ironic, but it's in the preface of the great liturgies of the church at Easter time. Because for Lewis, it didn't stop at evil, it was about salvation. But there was a second, other medieval theme that emerges in Lewis's fantasy fiction, and we somewhat talked about this. It's the antidote to evil. And it was this, for Lewis and Tolkien: to maintain faith in the little imaginative things that grow out of the mundane. When we look with faith, the simple becomes transcendent. And that's a big, big theme, what they're trying to say. It's the little people who do great things, because it's by faith that the seemingly mundane changes the world. So who are their heroes? For Lewis, it's little children. For Tolkien, it's a hobbit. Why? Because the little people can become humble. The big people lust for power. And it's a great message in the Bible that you can have great power, like a King Saul, but you become worthless to God. Because it's not by power, as the prophet says, nor by might, but by the Spirit of the living God. And that's why when Jesus, if you were coming as the Messiah, would you pick the men he did to be the 12 disciples? I'm thinking, Lord, let's go get Caesar. Let's go to Rome and let's get Caesar as your Peter. That's not how God thinks. He gets a Peter whom he sends to Rome. And eventually, by faith, sees a Caesar 300 years later in Constantine become Christian. Lewis and Tolkien got this. And that's a biblical message. Humility is the way to true power in the Bible. Power is the way to pride and destruction. Pride is at the threshold of all of the vices of fallenness. And humility, that is so poorly understood in the modern pop Christian culture world. Who talks about humility? Have you found a great book on humility lately? Wonder why. Man, Satan's already got us, right? But you can find a lot of books about power and how to get power. Well, in The Silver Chair, Lewis's book, he said, quote, "The witch tries to stop goodness by denying the possibility of putting a romantic shine on the mundane world." She's always trying to do that. If you've read that story. She says, quote, "Look how you can put," she's speaking to the Marsh Wiggle and the travelers with him. "Look how you can put nothing into your make-believe without copying it from the real world. This work of mine, which is the only world, i.e. the world below is the real one." And in The Silver Chair, she's made this world that she says is the real world, and it's the world below. It's hell. And that's the way fallen humans think. They think hell is the real world. That's not the real world. That's not what God ordained. And then old great Puddleglum, the Marsh Wiggle, responds with these words. He says, "We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But for babies," maybe is Lewis thinking about the Inklings? The four? Maybe. "But for babies, playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow." Tolkien's medieval world is very similar. First, he imagined, a great insight of the medievalist Cantor says, here's how Tolkien's mind worked. Tolkien worked from language to world. Now that's some kind of brilliance, right? So this medievalist says, well, first Tolkien imagined language, then the story of long journey and quest. That's a big, big aspect of Tolkien. Long journey and quest in that language. Tolkien made up the language of the Lord of the Rings before he wrote the story. And that's what he's saying. He made up the language, and then he produced a story that reflected the language. Now that's something to think about in the church, isn't it? That the language we speak, whether we realize it or not, is going to convey a world and a life view. Well, he says, then Tolkien pretended that he was translating from that epic into modern English. So he starts with his language, his old rune Norse language, whatever it was, creates a story, and then in his mind, he's going to put that into modern English. Because when you read Lord of the Rings, don't you have in the back of your mind that there is this language that they're speaking? And they were, because Tolkien had created the language first before he wrote the story. By the way, he hand-typed himself, one copy, carried it all over the place. I mean, you know, it'd drive publishers crazy nowadays. But of course, you know, they didn't have copying machines. So he moved from language to story to modern English, retaining the proper nouns and a few other key words. Cantor says, a triple-decker work of imagination. Old language, story, translation. Tolkien explained to the great poet W.H. Auden, quote, "It has always been with me the sensibility to linguistic pattern which affects me emotionally like color of music." It's an amazing mind, right? That's the way you think, right? It's the way I think. No. Linguistic pattern affects me emotionally like color of music. The deep responses to legends that I would call the northwestern temper and temperature. Then in 1947, Tolkien writes elsewhere, as he defends fantasizing, quote, "Fantasy remains a human right in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and the likeness of our Maker." For Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings captures three basic elements of medieval civilization. First, it communicates the experience of endemic war and fear of armed bands that was a frequent condition of the period from AD 400 to the middle of the 11th century. The dark force of incipient terrorism in the form of armed invasion was a constant threat and fell particularly on the village society, the common people. And of course, the Lord used that to turn a culture of the Middle Ages to himself, who cried out for God to save it because they saw no way, with the hordes of thousands ready to march over Europe for this culture to be defended. And about all you can say is, God protected Western culture in the 15th century. Well, we know Constantinople fell when the Ottoman Empire ran over it in circa 1452, and those amazing scholars were driven out of Constantinople and they fled into Europe and became professors who taught the reformers of the next generation.
Bishop, I hate to interrupt, but we need to move to the next session. We need workshops. So
Yeah.
Is it all right if we take a couple of questions?
Yeah, I got to finish this though, so. Second, the rings makes us feel the circumstances and condition of a long journey, undertaken not by a great nobleman with a powerful retinue, but by an ordinary soldier with 2 or 3 companions. Again, it's the small people. And third, Tolkien stresses for us what C.S. Lewis believed, that medieval heroism was not a special manifestation of an aristocratic culture, but something that existed among people of relatively humble origin, like the hobbits. And I'll leave you with this one last statement. that's in Lewis's The Last Battle. The message of both Tolkien and him resounds, quote, "Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before." Okay, maybe a couple of questions now to keep Father Casey happy.
I have one question that was submitted. Did anybody else submit a question via email? And I didn't receive it. Okay. Question was, which writers from the Middle Ages did Lewis and Tolkien seem to appreciate?
Well, of course, they read theologians like Boethius, Dante, and Aquinas. They both read deeply in Thomas Aquinas and reflected his theological and philosophical construct, which we can take issue with, but to be fair to Aquinas, he was rescuing a plummeting theology in the Western world, with his categories. And he's one of the first great theologians who has a vision for converting Islam. But we could go on. Good question.
Any other questions? The email address is AWI 2014 at holycommuniondallas.org. Thank you, Bishop Sutton.
You're welcome. Thank you.